This is the image they tried to bury. 4 flags, 4 allied nations, not enemies, not adversaries. America's closest friends in the world standing shoulder to shoulder, and not with Washington. As of this morning, Friday, February 28th, 2026, the geopolitical landscape of the Western alliance has fractured in a way that no one in the White House saw coming. For the first time in the post-war era, the United Kingdom, Australia, Japan, and Canada have jointly signaled their intent to build an economic architecture that deliberately routes around the United States of America. We are not talking about a vague communique. We are not talking about diplomatic hand-wringing at the United Nations. We are talking about the formal launch of negotiations to merge the European Union's single market with the 12-nation Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, into what trade analysts are already calling the largest economic alliance in modern history, a bloc of nearly 40 nations, a combined market of 1.5 billion consumers, and a GDP that dwarfs the American economy by a factor of 2. In this special report, we are going to break down exactly how 4 of America's closest allies turned against Trump's tariff regime. We are going to explain the legal earthquake that made this inevitable. We are going to show you the hidden trade mechanism that could permanently redirect global supply chains away from American factories. And we are going to answer the question everyone in Washington is afraid to ask. Has the United States just lost control of the global economic order it spent 80 years building? Buckle up. History is being rewritten in real time. To understand why this is happening now, right now, in the last week of February 2026, you have to follow the chain of detonations that led us here. Start with February 20th. The United States Supreme Court, in a devastating 6-3 ruling in Learning Resources, Inc. versus Trump, declared that the president's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose tariffs was unconstitutional. The IEEPA tariffs, the backbone of Trump's entire reciprocal tariff regime since Liberation Day in April 2025, were struck down in a single morning. The court ruled that tariffs function as taxes, and taxes belong to Congress, not to a presidential emergency declaration. Chief Justice Roberts and the 5 concurring justices effectively told the president that he had been operating outside the law for over a year. Think about the magnitude of that. According to the Tax Foundation, $133.5 billion in tariff revenue collected under IEPA may now need to be refunded to American importers. That is not a rounding error. That is a fiscal crater the size of the entire Department of Education budget. The legal foundation of Trump's trade war just imploded. But here is the catch. Trump did not retreat. Within hours of the ruling, while the ink on the opinion was still wet, the president went on Truth Social and announced a replacement, a 10% global tariff under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. By Saturday, February 21st, he raised it to 15%. Section 122 is an obscure Cold War-era provision that allows the president to impose temporary import surcharges to address balance of payments deficits. The maximum rate is 15%. The maximum duration is 150 days. It was last used by Richard Nixon in 1971. And here is the critical detail nobody in the mainstream media is explaining. Section 122 does not allow country-specific rates. It is a blanket surcharge. Every nation gets the same rate. This means that the carefully negotiated deals Trump struck with Japan, the UK, the EU, South Korea, and a dozen other nations throughout 2025 are now functionally meaningless. Japan pledged $550 billion in investment in the United States in exchange for a tariff reduction from 24% down to 15%. After the Supreme Court ruling and the Section 122 replacement, Japan is now paying the exact same 15% as countries that invested nothing. Zero. Let that sink in. Sources inside Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry say the mood in Tokyo is one of controlled fury. Trade Minister Ryosei Akazawa stated publicly on Tuesday, February 24th, that Japan's position should not be worse off than under the original agreement. Behind closed doors, according to leaked diplomatic cables reported by Nikkei Asia, Japanese officials are using far stronger language. One senior trade official reportedly told EU counterparts that Tokyo feels it has been conned. They paid $550 billion for a handshake that evaporated overnight. The United Kingdom is in a nearly identical position. London struck a deal in May 2025, the so-called Economic Prosperity Deal, which included preferential tariff rates on automobiles, capping auto tariffs at 10% for up to 100,000 vehicles. According to analysis from Global Trade Alert, the UK now faces a 2.1 percentage point increase in its average trade-weighted tariff rate, Under the new Section 122 regime, British exports to the United States were worth approximately $68 billion in 2025. That 2.1 percentage point increase translates to over $1.4 billion in additional annual costs passed directly to British exporters and manufacturers. Sources inside the UK's Department for Business and Trade describe the situation as a betrayal. British officials negotiated in good faith throughout the summer of 2025. They made concessions on agricultural imports and defense procurement. They fast-tracked regulatory alignment on financial services. And now a Supreme Court ruling in a case brought by a toy company and a wine importer has eviscerated the entire framework. The European Commission issued a statement saying, "A deal is a deal," but Brussels knows perfectly well that the deal has no legal enforcement mechanism anymore. It gets worse. And then there is Canada. Mark Carney, the former Bank of England governor turned Canadian Prime Minister, has been preparing for this exact moment since the day he took office. Carney watched Trump threaten 100% tariffs on Canadian goods after Ottawa explored a trade agreement with China. He watched Trump demand ownership of the $5.7 billion Gordie Howe International Bridge, a project that Canada paid for with American steel and American labor. He watched the White House press secretary call him Governor Carney, a deliberate insult designed to delegitimize Canadian sovereignty. And he responded not with tweets, not with counter threats, but with the most dangerous weapon in global economics, a phone call. According to sources close to the discussions, reported by Politico and confirmed by Global News Canada, Carney personally initiated calls with the prime ministers of Australia and New Zealand in late January 2026. Those calls led to a cascade. Within weeks, Canada was spearheading formal negotiations to link the CPTPP and the European Union into a unified trading framework. The CPTPP already includes Canada, Japan, Australia, the UK, Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, Mexico, Chile, Peru, Brunei, and New Zealand. The EU is the world's largest single market with 27 member states. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, Carney declared that Canada was uniquely positioned to broker a bridge between the two blocs. He called on middle powers to resist economic coercion. He predicted this alliance would encompass a market of 1.5 billion people. Here is what nobody is talking about. The mechanism they are using is called cumulation. It is the quiet weapon of trade policy that could detonate the entire logic of Trump's tariff regime. Cumulation allows manufacturers to source components from any member of the trading bloc and still qualify for preferential tariff treatment. Consider a lithium battery. The lithium is mined in Australia. The cathode is manufactured in Japan. The cells are assembled in Vietnam. The battery pack is integrated into an electric vehicle in Germany. Under current rules, each leg of that journey faces separate tariff assessments. Under cumulation, the entire chain is treated as if it occurred within a single market. The battery enters the EU tariff-free. An American battery manufacturer, by contrast, faces a 15% surcharge just to export components to those same markets. This is not a tariff wall around 39 nations. It is a tariff moat, and the United States is on the wrong side of it. Companies currently manufacturing in the United States to avoid tariffs would have an economic incentive to relocate to CPTPP or EU nations instead. The entire logic of Trump's tariff regime, the central promise that tariffs bring factories home, would reverse, factories would leave, investment would flow outward, the $550 billion that Japan pledged. Sources say Toyota, Honda, and Mitsubishi executives are already reviewing whether those commitments remain strategically viable. Let us push the scenario to its extreme. What happens if this megablock succeeds? The combined GDP of the EU and CPTPP nations is approximately $38 trillion. The United States GDP is approximately $29 trillion. For the first time since the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, the United States would not be the gravitational center of global trade. American companies exporting to Europe, Asia, and the Pacific would face tariff disadvantages compared to competitors operating within the bloc. American farmers selling wheat, soybeans, and corn to Japan and the UK would be undercut by Canadian and Australian producers who enjoy preferential access through the CPTPP. According to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, this would represent the most significant restructuring of the global trading order since the creation of the World Trade Organization in 1995. And here is the irony that should keep every trade advisor in Washington awake at night. The CPTPP was originally the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, a deal designed by the United States, championed by the Obama administration, and killed by Donald Trump on his third day in office in January 2017. America built this architecture. America walked away from it. and now America's closest allies are using that exact same architecture as a weapon against American tariffs. The German Chamber of Commerce and the British Chambers of Commerce have both publicly endorsed the EU CPTPP negotiations. This is not a fantasy. This is not a hypothetical. The preliminary framework discussions are already underway. The psychological dimension of this crisis cannot be overstated. Trump has built his entire political identity on the idea that America is being ripped off, that foreign nations are exploiting American generosity, and that tariffs restore the balance. His base, the 45 to 75 demographic that constitutes his most loyal voters, believes this deeply. But the data tells a devastating counterstory. According to the Tax Foundation, Trump's tariffs amount to an average tax increase of $1,500 per American household in 2026. That money is not coming from China or Canada. It is coming directly from the wallets of American consumers. The tariffs represent the largest tax increase as a percentage of GDP since 1993. And with the Supreme Court ruling $133.5 billion in already collected IEEPA tariffs may need to be refunded. This is not economic strategy. This is fiscal chaos dressed in a flag. Sources inside the West Wing describe the reaction to the four-nation alignment as a combination of denial and fury. The president reportedly told his trade team that Carney is a nobody running a country with the GDP of Texas. He dismissed the CPTPP as irrelevant, but the numbers demolish that dismissal. The 12 CPTPP nations plus the 27 EU member states represent 39 countries, 1.5 billion people, and $38 trillion in economic output. They control dominant global shares of automotive manufacturing, semiconductor fabrication, pharmaceutical production, critical mineral extraction, and agricultural commodities. When Trump says this alliance is irrelevant, he is saying that Japan, the world's fourth largest economy, is irrelevant. He is saying the United Kingdom, America's closest military ally, is irrelevant. He is saying Australia, the anchor of the AUKUS Defense Pact, is irrelevant. Here's the domino effect the White House is not modeling. Japan's $550 billion investment pledge was contingent on a stable tariff environment. The Supreme Court ruling destroyed that stability. If Japan redirects even 20% of that investment toward EU or CPTPP markets, that is $110 billion in factories, jobs, and infrastructure that never arrives in Ohio, Tennessee, or South Carolina. Australia supplies $6.2 billion in critical minerals annually, including rare earths essential for defense manufacturing and EV batteries. If Canberra prioritizes CPTPP supply chain integration, American defense contractors face component shortages. The UK's City of London financial sector processes trillions in daily transactions. If Britain aligns its regulatory framework with the EU CPTPP bloc, Wall Street loses a critical bridge to global capital flows. Each domino falls silently in corporate boardrooms and ministerial offices, but the hemorrhage of strategic influence is real. What does Beijing think when it sees this? Here is the answer no one in the administration wants to confront. China sees an opportunity. The strategic rationale for Trump's tariffs was to isolate Beijing, to decouple supply chains, to force allies to choose Washington over the Chinese Communist Party. But the four-nation alliance is not choosing Beijing. It is choosing a third path, an economic order that is neither American-led nor Chinese-led, built on the rules-based trading system that the United States created and then walked away from. China watches with fascination because every nation joining the EU CPTPP bloc becomes less dependent on both Washington and Beijing simultaneously. Trump's tariffs were supposed to be a weapon against China. Instead, they have catalyzed a trading system that marginalizes both superpowers. It is the greatest strategic own goal in American diplomatic history since the Senate rejected the League of Nations in 1920. The base is splitting. According to recent polling data, Trump's approval on economic management has dropped to 41%, the lowest of his second term. Rural farmers in Iowa and Nebraska who export soybeans and pork to Japan are watching their market access evaporate as Tokyo redirects purchasing toward Australian and Canadian producers within the CPTPP. Auto workers in Michigan and Ohio who were promised a manufacturing renaissance are watching Japanese and European automakers pause planned U.S. factory investments. Small business importers who paid IEPA tariffs for over a year are now learning those tariffs were illegal and are demanding refunds that the Treasury cannot afford to issue. The coalition that elected Trump on the promise of economic nationalism is discovering that economic nationalism has a bill, and it is now due. History teaches us that when great powers turn inward, the world does not wait. When Britain retreated from free trade in the 1930s with the Ottawa Imperial Preferences, it accelerated the collapse of the global trading order and contributed to the conditions that produced the catastrophe of the Second World War. When the United States rejected the Trans-Pacific Partnership in 2017, it created a vacuum that China filled with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the world's largest trading bloc by population. Now the vacuum is being filled again, not by an adversary, but by America's own allies. This is exactly what the architects of the post-war order feared. Dean Acheson, George Marshall, and the builders of the Bretton Woods system understood that American prosperity depended on American leadership, not dominance, leadership, the willingness to build institutions that served everyone. The tariff regime has shattered that compact. This is not trade policy anymore. This is the stress test of the American century. Can the United States maintain its global economic leadership while simultaneously taxing its own allies into building a rival system? Can the dollar retain its reserve currency status when the nations that hold it are constructing alternative trade channels that bypass American markets entirely? Can the defense alliances that protect American interests across the Pacific and Europe survive when those same allies view Washington as an economic adversary? We are watching the foundations crack in real time. The four-nation alignment is not a diplomatic protest. It is a structural shift. It is the world saying quietly, firmly, and with the full weight of $38 trillion in combined economic output, we will build without you. So what happens next? Watch the CPTPP ministerial meeting scheduled for late March 2026. Watch for the joint EU-CPTPP working group on rules of origin to announce its preliminary framework. Watch for Japan's trade minister to deliver what sources describe as a major policy address on supply chain diversification within the next 2 weeks. Watch for the UK to announce new bilateral trade terms with Australia and Canada that deliberately undercut American competitive advantages in agricultural and defense exports. Watch for the Canadian Parliament to ratify expanded retaliatory tariffs on American steel and aluminum goods, still subject to Section 232. Each of these moves will happen without the drama of a presidential tweet. But together, they represent the slow, methodical construction of a post-American trade order. The president will respond. It will not be with diplomacy. It will not be with compromise. Sources inside the White House say the options being discussed range from secondary tariffs on nations that participate in the EU CPTPP framework to threats of reduced military commitments to allied nations who join the bloc. Every option is an escalation. Every escalation pushes more nations into the alliance. The trap is already sprung, and the man who set it does not realize he is the one standing inside it. For one man sitting in the Oval Office, surrounded by advisors who told him that tariffs were the ultimate leverage, this week has been an apocalypse of miscalculation. The Supreme Court took away his legal authority on February 20th. The Allies took away his economic leverage by February 28th. And the markets, still hemorrhaging from 13 months of tariff-induced chaos, took away the narrative that this was all part of some grand strategic design. There is no master plan. There is a 15% global surcharge that expires in 150 days, $133.5 billion in potentially illegal tariff collections, a U.S. House of Representatives that voted against his Canada tariffs with Republican defections, and 39 nations building a trading system that does not need the United States to function. The walls of American trade hegemony are not crumbling from the outside. They are being breached from within by the very allies who once stood behind them. The flags of the UK, Australia, Japan, and Canada are no longer flying beside the stars and stripes. They are planting new ones on new ground in a new economic order. And Donald Trump, the man who promised to make America great again, may have just made America alone. Subscribe. Stay tuned. The maps of global trade are being redrawn this spring, and the history books will remember this week as the moment the post-American economy was born. Let us get technical about what rules of origin accumulation actually means in practice, because this is the mechanism that will determine whether the EU CPTPP megablock becomes a permanent fixture or collapses under its own complexity. Under standard trade agreements, a product qualifies for preferential tariff treatment only if a certain percentage of its value, typically between 35 and 55%, originates within the partner country. This is called the value-added threshold. But under diagonal cumulation, which is the specific model the EU CPTPP framework is proposing, value added in any member country of either bloc counts toward meeting the threshold. According to the Carnegie Endowment, preliminary negotiations could produce a framework agreement by the fourth quarter of 2026. If ratified, the United States will face a choice no American president has confronted since 1945. Join the system the world is building, or watch it be built without us. The clock is ticking. 150 days.